Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. Supplier Experience Management is a new area of focus for most procurement teams, even though we often serve as the primary point of contact for suppliers. We just haven't really thought about it before. If we want to improve the supplier experience though, and become a customer of choice in the process, we're going to need to revisit many of our policies, our processes, and our programs. So in an effort to better understand the supplier experience and the opportunity associated with improving it, we partnered with HICX in the summer of 2021 to run a 3-part AOP Live series. We're joined by leading practitioners to answer audience questions really across 3 broad topics. One was making a business case for supplier experience management. 2 was looking at the present and future of supplier experience management in practice and articulating the ROI associated with world-class supplier experience management. We had 3 hours of conversation. They were full of insights and inspiration, but what we thought we'd do today is actually edit the best portions of each one of those conversations into a single podcast. In the first session, we were joined by Charlotte Brabant, a representative from ISM, and Ramit Mahajan, the head of supply chain enablement for EMEA at Henkel. And we talked about the benefits associated with creating a good enough supplier experience to be seen as a customer of choice, what that looks like in practice, and whether the disruptions of the last 2 years have impacted how executive leadership regards that objective. So let's go into that first session.
One of the things that procurement has talked about for a long time that I wonder if we've changed our thoughts on is this notion about wanting to be a customer of choice with certain key or strategic suppliers, depending on the terminology that your organization uses. Charlotte, would you say that, previously being a customer of choice probably was around, access to information or opportunities to innovate or collaborate, but over the last year and a half, being a customer of choice meant having your order filled completely or having your order filled on time. Did you notice any changes to what it actually meant to see when your organization was a customer of choice and the types of relationships that existed with the suppliers that seemed to work with you in that way?
Well, absolutely, there has been a change. I think in the past, you were that customer of choice if you, for example, had a big spend for your supplier, or you had that good collaboration or that innovation, as you just mentioned. Yeah. I think being that strategic customer of choice now and in the future, it really relied on a lot of open communication, strong listening, establishing that trust with each other. I think in terms of being that customer of choice now, it depends, of course, on the situation, whether yes, it's a small supplier, big supplier, how important are we to the supplier? But ultimately that dialogue, if the supplier, for example, needed to have immediate payment terms, not just blocking it off, but actually bringing that topic internally to your leadership, discussing it. When do we give immediate payment terms? When can we support the supplier? Where can we adjust? So I think it's a very much individualized case, but now being that customer of choice, you cannot just, like in the olden days, 10 years ago when I was in automotive, come with the hammer and just tell the supplier we need a price reduction, deliver. No, it has completely changed. Now it's really a matter of the customer of choice going into that dialogue, being that partner they wish they had, and them wanting to collaborate with you. Because at the end of the day, if you have a good relationship with your supplier, you will be the one benefiting in the future. And if there is another crisis, if they have a limited amount of stock, who do you think they'll be giving their supplies to? The one who's always come with the hammer, or the one who has actually been there, supported them, listened, had a relationship? And when they were in need with payment terms, or when they came up with an innovation, actually listening to them and making them feel important, making them feel listened to. I think this is really a big wake-up call for all of us, for many buyers, that the way we've done it in the past, it definitely changed in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ramit, I want to come to you and ask a similar question, and then I'm going to check in with Phil and see what's coming up in the Q&A chat with the audience. Would you say that your personal and your team and your company's notion of what is required to be a customer of choice has changed or evolved in any way based on the experience of the last year and a half?
I would say, first of all, I really agree with what Charlotte said. And, for us, I think we were always in Henkel, we were always making sure that we are a customer of choice. But this pandemic really brought up the importance of that topic. So we were making sure that the suppliers that really need the money to survive were getting that money to survive, because there were many of these, much smaller suppliers who the working capital really, the importance of working capital really came up during this pandemic. So we made sure that wherever we needed to have these suppliers sustain themselves, we made sure of that. We made sure that we were recognizing them at every point, because each of them we could see were really going way beyond their mandate. So they were actually, if it was material suppliers, they were finding all sorts of novel ways to get the material to our factories. If it was, let's say, logistics suppliers, they were making sure that they were opening their warehouses or giving us trucks, even though, let's say in many places the truck drivers were kind of gone missing, but the suppliers were working really day and night to make sure that we were getting all of these facilities just to kind of have our operations running. So I think the importance of being a customer of choice was really highlighted during this pandemic, like never before. Yeah.
Excellent. So Phil, let me check in with you briefly and get sort of a read on where our audience is. Have any questions or comments come in that we should incorporate in this part of the discussion?
Yeah, I do have one question, and I also just want to encourage, first of all, thank you, Kelly, for coming to me. I do want to encourage everybody to pop questions in the chat or in the Q&A, because I am keeping a watch on them. But I do have one question, and I'm going to pose it to Ramit first, and then Charlotte can answer as well. And both of you spoke there about customer of choice becoming more important, which is music to my ears, because it's something that I'm a really big advocate of. I think that it's an imperative for procurement. But the question that we have is, is this a systemic change for procurement? That customer of choice is now accepted by our organizations as something we should be focusing on post-pandemic, or do you feel it was more in response to short-term needs through the pandemic, and that perhaps it goes back to business as usual when we go back to whatever, not necessarily normal, but some consistency is? And Ramit, I'll ask that to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think that's a great question. So what I would say is that, depending on the companies, especially in Henkel or many other organizations that I know of, I think this is something that's here to stay. I don't think that this is a passing fad. In fact, any company that has a long-term vision. So in Henkel, in fact, we actually talk about being for the good of generations. So any company that has a long-term vision will make sure that the supplier network is sustainable. It's not something that we can just take for granted and move from one supplier to the other just on the basis of price. This is something that we've never had even in the past, but I think now it's paramount that we will be making sure that the supplier network is a sturdy one, is resilient one, and of course is very agile. Yeah.
Definitely encouraging to hear, because there's a danger of us kind of being responsive in the moment. And what we often see in procurement and supply chain is kind of this cyclical nature of where we think about customer of choice, and then we go back to, well, we need to save money, and the priorities change. So keeping it front and center is going to be so important. Charlotte, are you seeing the same?
Absolutely. In terms of the systemic change, it will also be, I think it will really penetrate throughout organizations, different parts of the organization. It will actually, I think in the future, it will become part of a new strategic framework, similar to what we have now, what we call the employee experience. We will have the customer experience. And I wonder whether in the future, because now it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's the first time we're talking about it, but it is something new that we are looking at the whole this whole change separately. And I wonder who will actually own it in the future and what the future will behold, and whether in organizations they will be maybe this will be a new role within the organization, so having a lead for supplier experience, or making sure that that being that customer of choice is a new variable within the company, something that we want to strive, and becoming that new measurement. Who knows? But I think it is definitely a change, and that's here to stay.
So we're starting to see some change, maybe not as much as we would like, but it seems to be lasting, which is a very good sign for procurement and for suppliers. Now, in part 2, we talked about the importance of data to supplier experience management. That includes the quality of our current data and the process for improving that data in the future. We were joined by Adam Brown, head of the digital garage at BT Sourced, and Kostas Zylianis, the CEO of HICX. In this excerpt, Adam and Kostas talked about one of the key findings from HICX's research into supplier experience management. As you will hear, they may have uncovered a misalignment between how procurement would rate themselves as a partner and what the supplier experience is actually like in practice. Let's listen in to their exchange.
One of the interesting findings is that although 78% of procurement professionals think that their suppliers would rate them as excellent or best in class, when it comes to the reality of what their current supplier experience actually is, we're not sure that what they think they're creating and how they think suppliers would rate them is in fact how they're doing and how those suppliers would rate them. So Kostas, can I start with you, just some observations around any disparity that you've uncovered in terms of how procurement would rate themselves versus how they're actually doing or how suppliers would rate them?
Yeah, and I think some of that comes out in the survey, but we've also experienced some of that being a supplier working with very large organizations. I think a lot of them might think of best in class as a function, how much savings are we delivering versus, how would our suppliers necessarily rate us? If you put it from the supplier's perspective, I think there's a lot of burden which is actually put on the supplier, whether they know it or not, or do it purposefully or not. But there's always a lot of different systems, a lot of communications, a lot of big documents where what they say is, look, it's your responsibility now. We've shared all this wonderful information, and you can go through, distill it, and you have to make sure that you adhere to it, you comply to it, you update, all this kind of thing. So there's a huge burden to assimilate, understand, and figure out exactly what you need to do. So I would look at it, quite different maybe from the supplier's point of view than what they would think internally.
Yeah. And Adam, to pull you into this, I mean, it's always possible to say, self-assessment, right, versus objective assessment on any function, any company, right, absolutely anything you're trying to evaluate. But any initial observations you would have around how procurement evaluates themselves around the supplier experience that we create versus what it likely really is like to go through?
Yeah, so I was really surprised. I was really surprised at saying 78% thought that they were excellent. I'm not so convinced, and I think it's a case of perspective. Yeah, and so it could be as Kostas said, that they're rating themselves as a procurement function, but no, to take this as 78% of procurement people really think that the supplier experience is fantastic. Possibly for that segment of the process that procurement professional is actually involved in. But when you widen this out and say you've got everything from how do I, as a supplier, even first engage with a big company, how do I engage with them? How do I even contact them? Is there even anything on the website that I can go to? So going from that very first bit all the way through to then the basic checks that, you know, we as all companies do the same checks. You know, are you financially stable? You know, do you have disqualified directors? Are you in a sanctioned country? Those basic checks, you think with some suppliers you do it on a system, with others you're doing emails, with others you're doing phone calls. And so you have so many suppliers, you're having to do these, you have so many customers as a supplier, you have to do it in so many ways. The procurement people are not necessarily involved in that and view it as being just a quick, simple thing. It's not really until we're dealing with the sourcing to contracting bit that the procurement folk are really strongly involved. And perhaps, you know, 78% are brilliant at that. And that would probably ring a little bit truer to say, you know what, as a procurement professional, I deal with my suppliers incredibly, you know, politely, efficiently, well. We maybe have a really great way of, you know, doing our contracting with them. But then once you've finished that bit, you're then into the onboarding phase of then getting all of the bank details and doing all of the checks. Have you got the right certificates? And it goes on and on. So I think the two bits at the end, with the transformation stuff that I'm doing, with that digitization of the end-to-end process, that's where I get the biggest kind of pain points for our suppliers. Is the two extremes at either end, because suppliers and procurement, you know what, we're actually really used to talking to each other. We're really used to negotiating on contracts. We're used to that bit. It's the pain at the extremities which you think, oh, goodness me, why can't every company just do it in the same way? Why can't I mean the obvious one is the onboarding and the validation checks. You know, every customer in the world wants to do the same checks with their suppliers. You basically want to make sure your supplier is, you know, good, robust, sensible, simple. We all have the same questions, but all do it in different ways. And so you're now seeing the advent of things like, you know, trust your supplier as an example, who are making an effort to simplify and standardize with blockchain just on that bit. And I think that's really, for me, it's down to the perspective bit and making sure that, you know, people are looking at the whole picture and not just, you know, one element.
By the way, I totally agree, sorry, with the end-to-end part.
No, please, Costas.
You brought it up. We find that as well with a lot of customers. Procurement is still in a way quite siloed, right? They'll onboard to transact, but it's, when you think of that whole thing, it might interact with the quality function, with the privacy function. They may have a separate sustainability function. And people are not looking generally end-to-end, and procurement in most organizations actually doesn't own the end-to-end. So I think that's super valid, right? Probably they're looking at, you know, my little slice, I'm doing it as good as I can, but no one's looking at, well, how is it from a company-wide perspective, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then even as procurement, and even if you take the procurement process and just say from some requirement coming into signing a contract, if you were to just cut at that source to contract bit and say that's the fundamentals of procurement, well, guess what? All you've done in that bit is the relationship with a supplier before you've actually started using the supplier. So to give you an analogy, you know, you've just procurement's taken care of like the first 3 dates in the relationship. There's a whole marriage to come, which really we're not involved in. And so that experience, and really once the supplier's got over, you know, great, we've got a contract in place, we've been approved, we've uploaded all of our certificates to the right place, we've done all of these things. My goodness me, we've now got to invoice. You know, have I got a purchase order? Has the purchase order come in? It has. Great. I've sent an invoice. Where do I send an invoice? How does that happen? How do I get paid? Who do I phone to chase up because something? And you've got all of that side of it without even considering just the operational day-to-day of, well, fundamentally you're a supplier delivering goods or service, without even considering that bit and the operational bit.
And as Adam pointed out, procurement may not always own the whole end-to-end process that suppliers experience, but from the perspective of those suppliers, they are responsible for all of it, the good and the bad. If we are going to be assigned responsibility for it, we should take every practical step we can to see our experience from their perspective. And so in the final installment of this series, Kelly was joined by Robert Bonner, then Global Procurement Director at SHV Energy, and now Global Procurement Director at BP, and Mary Beth Lang, Chief Supply Chain and Procurement Officer at Kaiser Permanente. They explored the meaning of supplier experience management and how it connects to other types of value and initiatives that procurement is already leading. So Rob and Mary Beth were talking about the expanded scope of supplier-related projects when Kelly asked them how supplier experience might actually change procurement as well. All right, let's listen in to that conversation.
So here's a question that comes to mind listening to you both talk about sort of the expansive projects and objectives that this type of investment in supplier experience might lead to. Is supplier experience, or in a formal, let's say, a formal investment in supplier experience, is that the kind of road that procurement can't travel down without being changed by it, either in terms of scope or priorities or talent requirements? Rob, I see you smiling and nodding. Do you see where I'm going with this? Do you think this is the kind of thing where we're saying, okay, we're going to put the supplier experience program in place to help our suppliers and be a better partner and all that, but are we really either indirectly or even unintentionally leading a greater change in procurement by elevating the need to have a good supplier experience?
Yeah, I enjoy the question, and I started smiling, Kelly, because you know at the very start we talked to Mary Beth, and you mentioned about the source to pay process, and I often think, well, look, procurement, we talk about source to pay, but then normally in procurement the actual pay bit isn't actually controlled by procurement. You know, accounts payable sat in finance in most organizations, separate to procurement. And so I often say, well, it's a bit crazy that we're busy talking about source to pay, and the pay bit might go completely wrong or out of our hands. Yeah, so there's straight away there's a piece around the supplier experience of payment. So I think you got to understand that, right? Hey, yeah, we can do all our snazzy sourcing, but if they don't ever get paid at the end of the process, then you can forget your supplier experience, yeah, because they're not going to be willing to talk to you about the fancy stuff if you just don't get the basics right. And then actually in the report, you know, you mentioned about the HICX report. The interesting thing for me about that was they started off by saying, right, okay, supplier record, yeah. So when you're actually onboarding the supplier and then you're maintaining that supplier record, and the admin and the interaction around that also is part of the supplier experience. So you understand that you can really be turning people off if you make their whole administrative experience and encounter with you, you know, let's say too much of a burden. And if you can get that stuff digitized, automated, clean and clear, then it does free you up to start doing the sexy stuff. Yeah, so you can start doing the proper sourcing, the proper interaction, the proper innovation. But you do need to have a certain level of hygiene sorted. Yeah, and I'd say previously we probably focused a lot on the hygiene without focusing on what it was going to free us up for. Yeah. And that's something that I see in procurement right now, is that people are much more interested in, okay, quick, get that hygiene sorted, the hygiene factor sorted, to free us up for this, because with that I think is the way that procurement really is moving, Kelly. I think we as a profession are all moving there anyway. So we're excited about the hygiene, but not for the hygiene's sake anymore. Yeah, about you know, it's not about making a couple of % of process efficiency. It's about how much can we free up for the next wave of procurement professionals to really focus on the relationship. And so, yes, I believe procurement is fundamentally changing because of it, because of the way in which we're directing. And well, it's something I'm excited about, because we've talked. Phil mentioned about trying to keep the suppliers separate before, and I have experienced situations where, and it sounds like maybe the same in the pandemic, but probably some other examples as well, where just by bringing those guys together, you actually unlock a whole lot of value you hadn't thought of. And so that, I think, the more people see the power of that, Kelly, then the more they get excited about the art of the possible. So the supplier experience becomes more and more important, because you sort out the hygiene, everyone turns to what's the innovation. Now you want those partners to be a true partner of you, but also of their peers, as you mentioned, maybe so the councils, that kind of thing, where everyone can bring their A game, and you can find out how it can fit together. So yes, you see, I got excited, Kelly, but it was I like the way the question was going. Yeah.
Yeah. And Mary Beth, you made the point earlier that it's not just about the big guys when we're talking about suppliers. So even though I'm kind of shortening it here and saying supplier experience, what we're really talking about is supplier experience management, because there's not one experience, there's not one type of suppliers. So when you think about both in terms of the ROI to Kaiser Permanente, to the supplier, and also in terms of what is required to create the necessary experience, what a large supplier needs or gets as an ROI may be completely different from what a smaller or local supplier needs in terms of ROI and experience. Any thoughts from you on sort of the difference between looking at ROI and experience with a large supplier versus with a smaller supplier?
Yeah, so I think we need to be mindful of how we show up as organizations. We found that we were able to make decisions differently in our whole decision process through COVID. We could be a little more agile. We could make decisions based on the collective information that was available. Instead of waiting for, from A to Z, we might have had A to P, and we needed to move. So I think we don't want to lose that agility in decision making, whether we're working with a smaller organization or a larger supplier. And it's mainly many times in negotiations or procurement, we're really thinking about our needs, and we learned how our actions and our intentionality could really make a stronger agreement for all of the suppliers involved. And so I think we'll carry that with us into regular practice after this next surge is hopefully through soon. And so I really believe that we need to think through the win-win on both sides of what we need, but also how we show up and how we are perceived as a partner throughout the whole process.
And so thank you very much for listening to today's podcast. I think the conclusion is that procurement has always had a supplier experience, but we've only recently started investing energy in designing and improving it. That's going to require process change, adjusted metrics, suitable data, and definitely a willingness to be self-reflective. If you're interested in listening to any of these webinars in full, I have linked to them all on the show notes episode of today's podcast. You can find that at artofprocurement.com/episode 433. That's artofprocurement.com/episode 433. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.